This is the last video we have on respiration or the respiratory system, and talks a little bit about section 10.5 talks a little bit about the control of breathing. And the primary control, the primary trigger to tell us to breathe is our nervous system. And there's something in our brain called the respiratory control center. And we haven't done the parts of the brain yet, but we think of the brain of that big part, and then there's a smaller part in the back that is called the brain stem that connects to the spinal cord. And in the brain stem, there's a part called the medulla oblongata. Where's that word? It's called it's in here somewhere. It's called the medulla oblongata, or the medulla. Here we go. And that's where our primitive functions are, like our functions that you don't have to be aware of them. It's a basic function of life, and so breathing's one of those. And so in our most primitive part of the brain is the respiratory control system that's telling us to inhale and exhale, and nervous system's triggering the appropriate intercostal and muscles and the diaphragm. And so we should continue to breathe, but we all know that we have sometimes we breathe faster than others, and there's reasons to breathe faster. Your muscles are exerting. So what's telling your nervous system that you need to breathe faster or slower? And it's talks about it here in this chemical control of breathing. Now, I go over some of this in the lab. So this is an interesting concept, and the experiment that you do with the phenol red has to do with this. I think a lot of people are surprised of what triggers us to breathe. Typically is high carbon dioxide, not low oxygen in our blood. So high carbon dioxide is really the trigger for breathing, not low oxygen. And the reason is because there's these chemoreceptors in some of our blood vessels and in our brain that are detecting pH. What happens is when carbon dioxide, remember that's the waste product of metabolism, combines with water, it forms carbonic acid. And so what happens in a liquid when an acid is formed? The pH drops. And the chemoreceptors in some of our blood vessels and our brain detect high carbon dioxide by sensing low pH, acidic pH. And that's going to cause you to breathe. And so that's really the primary trigger. And so one of the things that kind of I touch on in lab, if for example you hold your breath, whether you do it willingly or you have it blocked due to a disease, a health condition, or you're being choked, or you can't, you swallowed something that's blocking your airway. What's going to happen is your pH of your blood is going to drop, because your carbon dioxide will get high because you can't exhale it, and your pH is going to drop. And so that's something we would say you have alkalosis. You have respiratory alkalosis. Your blood is getting more alkaline. The pH is going, you have respiratory acidosis. Your pH is getting lower. It's getting more acidic because your respiratory system is blocked. You have high carbon dioxide, and that is deadly. Remember, our blood pH has to stay between 7.35 and 7.45. So not only will the lack of oxygen kill you, but the reduction in pH of your body fluids can kill you when you're choking. And so you have people that have diseases that they can't exhale well, they can't exchange oxygen well. It can alter the pH of their blood, and it can cause some really serious problems. So if we look at some of those diseases, I'm going to go to section 10.7. We look at some of the diseases of the respiratory system. We have upper respiratory tract infections, and just in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk a lot about these, but these are, and the reason why is they tend not to be quite as serious, because they're usually, they involve the upper respiratory tract where air is getting in and out, and it's a little bit easier to control these. it's a little bit easier to control these, and they tend not to be life-threatening. So I wanted to go down here and look at the lower respiratory tract infections. And so some of these you've heard of: acute bronchitis, and this is different than chronic bronchitis. Acute means you get an infection. Acute bronchitis is typically caused by a bacterial or a viral disease, and so you can get an infection of the bronchi, and usually what happens is you can get an upper respiratory tract infection, and maybe postnasal drip is causing you to cough. That's irritating your bronchi, and it causes some irritation and ultimately an infection in the bronchi. Pneumonia is a viral or bacterial infection of the lungs, and you can imagine that that starts getting more serious than bronchitis, because once you fill the alveoli up with fluid in the lungs, and that's what happens when you get inflammation, you get fluid accumulation, you can't exchange gases. In the bronchi, you might still be able to get some air through, but once the alveoli are filled and you have pneumonia, you're really not able to get very much gas exchange. So again, sometimes bronchitis can lead to pneumonia. Remember that we have those lobes in the lungs that are trying to help protect different areas from being, when one area is infected, that the whole thing doesn't become infected. Some of the other conditions that I wanted you to know about. Oh, here's a whole thing on e-cigarettes. If you have any interest in that, or you're using e-cigarettes, you might want to read that. Some other two other disorders I want to talk about, and those are chronic bronchitis and emphysema. I think emphysema is down here. Chronic bronchitis and emphysema are actually collectively a disease called COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. You might hear it called COPD, and that's chronic bronchitis, emphysema, and asthma, which we're not going to be talking about. But COPD is a really serious condition. It's not, you can't cure it, and it's definitely life-threatening. And so what's going to happen with somebody with COPD is they're going to lose their lung function, and quite often it's going to be a major contributor to death. And so when you have chronic bronchitis, which means you always have bronchitis, those bronchi are going to fill up with mucus, and it's just really hard to get air in and out. And the major reason why people get chronic bronchitis is exposure to pollution, or more oftenly smoking. And so when we talk about chronic bronchitis versus acute bronchitis, we said acute bronchitis is typically caused by a bacteria or virus, and it's curable. Chronic bronchitis is going to be a lifelong disease as a result of deteriorating conditions of your lungs. Emphysema, I think, is kind of interesting. If you've ever known someone with emphysema, they have a characteristic sound to their breathing. They can breathe in almost normally, take an inhalation, but when they go exhale, it usually seems labored, and it might have a loud, like a more obvious sound than what is typical. So they might be like in their exhale. And a lot of people, I've talked to a lot of students that know people that have emphysema, and it's a really obvious, distinct sound. And what's happening is when someone gets emphysema, and let me just start off with, most people get emphysema from smoking. Emphysema is considered COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And again, it's not curable, and it will likely contribute to death. So remember, our lungs have millions of those little alveoli. Well, with emphysema, after poor air quality and smoking throughout your life, the alveoli burst, and they merge into bigger air sacs. So you have less surface area in the lungs for gas exchange. But remember when I said if you have a tiny little air sac that has to be squished to move the air in and out, you just kind of squish them, and you can move the air in and out. I can move my diaphragm and my intercostal muscles. But when I have an air sac that's enlarged, it takes a lot more effort to squish that air out. So when somebody has emphysema, their residual volume, that volume that's left in the lungs after you exhale, is larger. and you have to push some of that out. So that's why exhaling can be very labored in somebody that has emphysema. They have to do the to make a forceful exhalation. Here it talks a little bit about asthma, and this is usually it's usually has some genetic component, and certain things can trigger it, but it's an inflammation of the bronchi and the bronchioles, and you can look that over. The last thing to mention is lung cancer, and again, we all know that smoking and other things can contribute to lung cancer, and so the best thing is just stop smoking. People do get lung cancer that haven't smoked. Unfortunately, I found out a few years ago that we had really high radon in my house, and that can be a contributor to lung cancer. And if you find that out, you really need to get a radon remediation thing installed, like it's a big fan underneath your house that blows the radon away. That you can buy little radon kits in Home Depot or Lowe's to test the radon in your house. But that is another contributor to lung cancer in this part of the country. Here's some nasty pictures of lungs of people that smoke and healthy lungs. So I'm going to stop right there.